Good afternoon. Thank you for joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and this is our webinar on FAST Act compliance, cover page tagging for SEC filers. This is a hot topic today. We have quite a few registrants. Let me talk to you a little bit about the agenda, what we're going to cover today, and who your speaker is going to be. We're going to start off with talking a little bit about the rule and then cover some common questions. Our first speaker is Lisa Cousineau. Lisa is the Director of XBRL Consulting Services, Professional Standards and Best Practices at Broadridge Financial Solutions. Second, we'll cover a couple of CPE questions. Then we're going to turn over to Steve Horowitz. Steve is Manager of Technical Services and Web Applications at NovaWorks. And Steve is going to be walking you through a review of the new DEI 2019 taxonomy and the new EFM. And he's going to talk a little bit about what to tag on the cover page. We'll follow that with a couple of additional CPE questions and then talk about other events and programs offered by XBRL US. Just a few technical points. As we go through the presentation today, we do encourage the submission of questions. You can just do that by clicking on the Q&A link at the top of your screen. Key your questions in, and then we'll take them as we go through the program. We are also offering CPE credit for this course, as we usually do. And to get your CPE credit, make sure that you respond to the poll questions, which will be taken at 2 points during the program. And if you have not signed on to get CPE, don't worry about it. Just respond to the polls and we can get you hooked up to get the CPE credit at the end. And the CPE forms will be sent out to you within a week or two of the completion of the presentation. We do plan on making the replay for the program available to everyone and also posting a copy of the slides because I think there's a lot of important information on them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Lisa Cousineau is going to talk to you a little bit about the rule, and so I'm going to stop sharing here. She's going to walk you through the rule and some common questions, and so let me turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Michelle. The FAST Act Modernization and Simplification of Regulation SK was adopted by the SEC to modernize and simplify certain disclosure requirements in Regulation XK in a manner that reduces the costs and burdens on registrants while continuing to provide all material information to investors. And it was also intended to improve the readability and navigability of disclosure documents to discourage repetition and disclosure of immaterial information. So the proposal was published for comment in 2017. The final rule was published on March 30th, and it became effective on May 2nd of this year. As a result of these new rules, registrants are now be required to tag cover page details on forms 10K, 10Q, 8Ks, 20Fs, and 40Fs. And the timing of tagging the cover page under the FAST Act are the same as the inline filing requirements. So for large accelerated filers, it's for fiscal periods ending after June 15th of this year. So for calendar year filers, that will be their second quarter filing. For accelerated filers that follow US GAAP, it'll be for fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2020. And then all other filers will be in 2 years for fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2021. So what changes were made to the forms? So on the 10K, the 20F, and the 40F, the SEC has now added a field for each class of registered securities. And on forms 10Q and 8K, they've added a field for the title of each class of registered securities, each exchange that they're traded on, where they're registered, and the trading symbol. A few common questions that have been out there. So one, does the rule require companies to tag the cover page for all 8K, 10K, and 10Q filings? And what about 20F and 40F cover pages? Or is it just those with financials in them? So the rule does apply to all forms for 20Fs and 40Fs. However, it's only when they're being used for annual reports and not registration statements. And the only exception is for filers who aren't subject to inline XBRL. So what are the compliance dates for these rules? And as you can see posted on the SEC's website, that they become effective once a filer is subject to submitting any of its filings in inline XBRL. So after this second quarter for calendar year filers, they file their second quarter 10Q in inline. Any subsequent Form 8Ks will now have to have the cover page tagged with this additional information, as well as that Form 10Q. So is the tagging of the 6K cover page required? No, at this time it is currently not required. Will there be new elements added to a taxonomy to tag these new data points? And when will that taxonomy be available? So yes, the SEC has approved a new 2019 DEI taxonomy with their EDGAR release 16.2 that just recently came out. And Steve is going to talk more about that in his section to cover the 2019 DEI taxonomy and give you some examples of what's going to be tagged on the cover page. So the SEC mentioned something about an Exhibit 104 as an inline document to contain the cover page for an 8K. Is that correct? If so, would you expect 10Ks and 10Qs to have this same Exhibit 104? So some of the cover page interactive data can be embedded in the cover page of the document, just like the financial statements and footnotes. And the remainder can be attached then as an exhibit under a new rule under Regulation SK, item 601B104. In doing some, as we filing agents are getting ready for this and looking at software, there was a question about a specific rule in the EDGAR Filer Manual 6.5.47 that talked about identifying information for companies. And in the red boxes, you'll see there's actually two different references. One references the state country code and the other references the country name. But based on some responses that Michelle submitted to the SEC, the state country code is actually correct, and they are going to correct this typo in the EDGAR Filer Manual in a future release. In addition, in the 2019 DEI schema file for the EDGAR state country item type, it's defined as a list of all SEC 2-character codes for states and countries. And there's also a list in the DEI file, but we found some discrepancies between these two. And we posed this question to the SEC to ask which one was correct. And so they communicated back that the EDGAR Filer Manual does have the correct translations and that they may correct this in a future update of the EDGAR Filer Manual. So that was my part of the presentation, Michelle, and I think we're going to turn it back to you for some CPE questions.
Great, thank you. And we do have, and I'm going to, let me just share my screen here. Second. Okay. And we do have some questions that we've received. So before we get into, let me get to mine. The first question we got is, so all Form 8Ks are required to have the cover page tagged regardless of whether it contains financial information. Lisa, is that correct? Is that a correct statement? It's all Form 8Ks are required to have cover page tagged regardless of whether it contains financial information.
Yes, that is correct. That the cover pages of 8Ks, once you filed that first 10Q and inline, then any 8K, whether it has financial information or not, is required to be tagged.
Right, and that's appropriate for any companies that or any reporting entities that are subject to inline XBRL, correct?
Yes. So for large accelerated filers, they are now mandated after June 15th to begin filing their first 10Q, not their 10K, but their first 10Q in inline XBRL. So all the accelerated filers, foreign filers, everyone else has at least another year or 2 years before they're mandated by the new rules.
Great. And then I think a follow-up to that, which I think you probably already clarified at this point, is So if a calendar year end filer files an 8K after 6/15, but before they file their second quarter 10Q, then that 8K would not be required to have the cover page tagged with inline XBRL, correct?
That is correct. They have
Okay,
to
great.
file their 10Q, their first inline document in Form 10Q with the SEC, then all subsequent 8Ks and then 10Qs and 10Ks will have the cover page tagged.
Right, great, okay. And then another question, do the 8Ks need to have the Exhibit 104 added?
They only need to have it added, I believe, if the information is not embedded in the cover page of the 8K.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and then one last question, and then we'll move on. I know we're getting a lot of questions here, but I want to make sure we cover everything. As a large accelerated filers, we file the 8K and 10Q for second quarter earnings on the same day. We do, however, file the 8K first and then the 10Q. Technically, we filed the 8K prior to the 10Q. Does the 8K need to have the cover page tagged, filed on the same day?
I would say after reading the rules, if they file their 8K first, it would not be subject to the requirements of tagging the cover page because they haven't filed their 10Q first. Okay,
is that for this first reporting period or that would be the case just for this first reporting period?
For this first reporting period. So basically the meter doesn't start running until they filed that first Form 10Q and inline. And then after that, all 8Ks, their cover pages will have to be tagged for 8Ks, 10Qs, and 10Ks.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a bunch of other questions, but I'm going to move on so we can get to the rest of the program. But then we'll come back to those questions if we have time at the end. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do some poll questions. So again, for those of you who are getting CPE, please make sure that you respond to these questions. So the first one, what new fields have been added to the cover page of the Form 10Q? Is it 1, the title for each class of registered securities? Is it 2, the exchange on which the securities are registered? Is it 3, the trading symbol? Or is it 4, all of the above? So please pick one of those 4 responses. And we'll take about another 30 seconds here. Okay, just about another 10 seconds. So which new fields have been added to the cover page of the Form 10Q? Okay, I'm going to close down the poll. And I'm going to go to our next question. Okay, what is the compliance date for accelerated filers using US GAAP? Is it fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2020? Is it fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2019? Or is it fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2021? So again, just click on the button that is the appropriate answer. And also just for the prior question, I know it's been asked if we could give answers to some of these questions. The answer to the previous poll was all of the above. All of those elements need to be tagged in the cover page. Okay, so just another 15 seconds here. What's the compliance date for accelerated filers using US GAAP? Okay, and we're going to close down our poll now. So the compliance date for accelerated filers using US GAAP is actually the fiscal period ending after June 15th, 2020 is the correct answer. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to turn it back over. Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Steve now. So Steve, if you'd like to share your screen and walk us through your slides.
Excellent. Just sharing that right now. Okay. So we're going to take a look at some of the Edgar Filer Manual 19.2 changes. A lot of these are going to be technical changes in how you actually apply this rule to your filing. The new version of the Edgar Filer Manual added several new sections, items 6545 through 6553 to the Edgar Filer Manual that addresses the requirements for these new cover page taggings that have to be done. Many of the new elements that are included in the Edgar Filer Manual 19.2 are not present in the DEI 2018 taxonomy. This means that you must have some kind of software that is compliant with the new taxonomy, DEI 2019, in order to be Edgar compliant. So that was released recently. So make sure you're using the most up-to-date version of whatever software vendor you are using to do your filings. They should have the 2019 taxonomy available for you to use to comply with these rules. The good news is the DEI 2019 taxonomy is structurally very similar to the DEI 2018 taxonomy. The biggest differences you're going to see are just some new elements being added, some new item types being added. So for example, like state codes are a new element type being added to allow you to tag a state. I think there's a new presentation role as well for the cover page. Before everyone was using document entity information as an abstract cover page, they have their own cover page presentation now you can use as a default presentation in the taxonomy. But let's take a look at some of the other changes the EFM introduces. One of the big ones is the idea of new transformations. In case you're unfamiliar with transformations, a transformation allows you to take one piece of data and convert it into something else that XBRL understands. For example, the first one we're going to talk about is the Boolean ballot box. It transforms a Unicode checkbox value into a Boolean true or false value. And this is really useful on the cover page when you have like your checkbox for on a 10K or 10Q, marking it as a quarterly report or a transition report. You're going to have a checkbox and one of those boxes is going to be checked. Using one of these transformations, you can convert that checkbox into a true or false value instead of having to tag inline the value true. There's also the exchange name English being added to convert an exchange name from a typed value that is more human readable to an SEC value. For example, Box Exchange LLC can be transformed to just Box, which is what the SEC is actually expecting for an exchange name. There are also transformations for state province names and country names. So you can transform a state and province code into a two-letter code, so Kentucky to KY, or you can transform a country name into a two-letter code, for example, United Kingdom into GB. There is also a transformation for the Edgar province country code, which transforms a province or country name into an actual Edgar code. So you can use this transformation to convert United Kingdom into X0, which is the Edgar expected value for United Kingdom. Now, your software should that you're using to tag this should handle a lot of this under the scenes, behind the scenes for you. You shouldn't have to specify exactly which transform you're using, although it is helpful just in case your software does require you to do that. It's going to vary from vendor to vendor exactly how this process works. But just be aware these transformations do exist and are available, so you don't have to put GB on your cover page instead of United Kingdom. You can have the nice human readable value that can be transformed into the machine readable GB. So let's take a look at some of the common elements, the general elements. EFM 6545 addresses which elements are required to be visible facts in all cover pages. And these are going to be common to all documents that are filed. Things like amendment description, which is required if you have amendments flag set to true. Interestingly enough, amendment flag looks like it's marked as required to be visible in the Edgar Filer manual, but I'm not sure if the Edgar system actually requires that. I've done test filings, doesn't seem to be required, so it might be a mistake in the EFM. We're still communicating with the SEC to get this ironed out. There are going to be some questions going forward, but contact your specific software vendor for more information about that to see if they've uncovered anything. Some of these other elements are going to be common to everything. For example, your fiscal period focus, your document fiscal year focus, your public entity registrant name, all things that should be visible on the cover page. You can see on this table, it has a column as required by. So these are not new requirements. These are elements that have been required to be on your report for a while now. This specific section of the EFM is just enumerating them and letting you know they're supposed to be visible on the cover page, and you shouldn't have them tagged as hidden facts. And with the exception of amendment flag, that makes a lot of sense. One of the new sections the SEC is adding to the EFM is going to be 6546, covering registered securities. And these are how you would tag these new requirements for registered securities on the cover page. So we have a couple of different elements here. For example, we have Security 12B title, Security 12G title. And if you look at this table, you can see both these are just normalized strings, which means you can put really any value in there. And this table is pretty valuable to take a look at. It is in the EFM. It's also obviously on this slideshow, and Michelle will distribute this slideshow to people after this so they can have it as a reference. But you can put any value in there. So if some examples in the last column, common shares as an example of Security 12B title. If you have no trading symbol, you can set the value of no trading symbol flag to true. If you do have a trading symbol, you would just not use that element, and you can use the trading symbol element instead, which also has a normalized string value. The Edgar Security Exchange name value is expecting an Edgar Exchange code, which is where you'd want to use one of these transformations. For example, a value it's expecting would be NYSE for New York Stock Exchange. If you have it spelled out on your report as New York Stock Exchange, you would need to use the transformation to convert it into this Edgar readable value. But that may be handled behind the scenes by your software vendor. You have to check with them. When you have multiple securities, some of these elements may have to be used multiple times. For example, if you have two Security 12B elements on your list, you're going to have to use the Security 12B title twice. And that necessitates using dimensions to break them apart. So the SEC has defined which elements you're going to use for dimensions. You would just use the statement class of stock axis or classes of share capital axis to differentiate these similar values. The Edgar Filer Manual does make it pretty clear that there should be no security title fact in a context without dimensions if a dimension is used to differentiate between multiple classes of stock. So if you do happen to have multiple classes of stock, all of your trading symbols should be under, all your securities titles should be under those dimensions. You shouldn't have any non-dimensional facts if you have at least one dimensional fact. Multiple exchanges should be handled the same way. If you have multiple exchanges, you're going to disaggregate those contexts using the entity listing exchange axis. You shouldn't have to use custom definitions for these members. Pretty much all of these should be defined in the exchange taxonomy, which is allowed to be used with these cover page filings. So for example, you can use the XNYS element for the New York Stock Exchange. You want to avoid using custom definitions here if possible. Let's take an example of from a filing of what that table might look like. Here we can see we have 4 rows in our table, 2 common class A's under 2 different stock exchanges. We have common class B under a New York Stock Exchange. And we also have our notes due year 2022 with no trading symbol under the New York Stock Exchange. We could tag this with the following elements. Our Security 12B title would be used for common class A, and that would also have 2 dimensions attached to it. It would have the dimension statement class of stock axis, using common class A as its class of stock, and it would also have our entity listings exchange axis, defining it as part of the New York Stock Exchange. The security exchange name value would be New York Stock Exchange, and for the second row, we would have common class A with the trading symbol that's dimensionalized and the security exchange name that is dimensionalized. Both of these would be using a 2-dimensional fact here. Let's go back to that. Accidentally press forward. So our next example, we have our 12B title, Common Class B. That would also be using a single dimension for Common Class B. It would be the statement class of stock axis with the Common Class B member. I would not need to use a dimension, though, for my security exchange name, because this particular security is only under one security exchange. I don't have to use 2 dimensions to do this. I can handle with just the one. Similarly, with the notes due on 2022, I would have to dimensionalize the security 12B title through my statement class of stock axis, but because it only appears under one security exchange, I would not have to use my entity listings exchange axis. So let's take a look at a couple of other elements that are being added in the new EFM. There are also company identifiers that need to be added. So these are going to be required in some form on most filings. Some forms have different requirements than others, and you should check the EFM to see exactly which forms require which. But if one of these elements are required, you actually have to use the element. For example, I had a question the other day, entity tax identification number. That is an expected value of type employer ID. And the EFM specifies that employer ID has to be an example value in this vein. It is a 2-digit number followed by a dash followed by a 7-digit number. And it must be like that. You cannot have N/A. You cannot have something of a different format. It has to be in a number in that format in order for the SEC to actually accept that value. So these new document types being added kind of restrict what you're allowed to put in there. In some cases, transformations can help. The entity incorporation state country code is expecting a 2-digit character string, like K9, KY or E9. But if a valid SEC transformation exists for those, for example, Kentucky, you can transform the state name Kentucky into that 2-character string and still file it. The SEC also provides a large list of address elements under 6548 of the EFM. These address elements allow you to break down your address into multiple data points. It can get somewhat low level. For example, you have to tag the city area code separately from the local phone number. So, for example, this is a Canadian address. The area code is split up separately from the local phone number. And you can use transformations, like I said before, to do things like Alberta is transformed into AB or Canada is transformed into CA, using those transformations to satisfy what the actual expected values for Edgar are. Anything that's of type normalized string does not need a transformation, and it's just going to be a raw string data. You can put whatever you want in there effectively, as long as you're below the limit. Each one of these elements has a limit of how many characters it allows, but they're fairly large. I think it was around 150 characters when I checked. So you shouldn't run into a situation where you're trying to put too much information into one of these lines. Another question I had the other day, people were asking, does it matter if I have my street and suite number, if I put them both on address line 1 versus address line 2? And from what I can tell, it looks like it does not matter. It's just you have to put them as though you would be putting them on an envelope. You have address line 1 for your first line, address line 2, address line 3. As long as you have a value in address line 1, you're meeting the requirements. And like I was saying before, these transformations can be used. So here is an example of what the actual code would look like to transform. For example, Alberta here, we have that wrapped in our non-numeric fact value for inline XBRL using this format value, which transforms it using this IXT SEC state province name English transformation. And that transforms Alberta into AB so that our element entity address state or province understands the value we're actually giving it. Similarly, Canada uses country name English to transform the value Canada into CA, so entity address country understands what we're talking about. EFM 6549 covers some values that are on the cover page as well. These are checkboxes generally, and these are going to use that new Boolean transform I was talking about a little earlier. So for example, the document quarterly report or document transition report, these are checkbox values that you would just tag in the report using an element with that transformation. So you can actually tag the checkbox using these values. Some of these are going to be date values as well. For example, we have the document period start date. It's expecting a value in the format 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day. There are plenty of transformations available for dates though. So if your date is in a different format, don't worry about it. You can probably transform it into this expected value so the SEC will take your date without too much difficulty. There are a pair of numbers that appear on a pair of values that appear only on the 20F, and these have a range of values that are accepted. So this is covered by EFM 6550, and these are the document accounting standard and other reporting standard item number. These are valid case-sensitive values given over here. So these are the only values that are acceptable for these elements. So outside of these values, you can put nothing else in these elements on your 20F, and these are both required by the 20F. 20F and 40F filers are required to have a contact person and address. So EFM 6551 covers this section. And these are going to look very similar to how you would handle the elements for the regular addresses. You just have to use these elements here to tag contact person addresses on 20F and 40F filings to conform with this EFM section. So just like you would tag the state code, the area code separate from the local phone number, you have to do that on 20Fs and 40Fs as well. $8Ks also have some specific checkbox values. On every 8K cover page, there is a set of 4 checkboxes near the bottom for written communication, soliciting material, pre-commencement tender offer, and pre-commencement issuer tender offer. So for those 4 checkboxes, you would tag those the same way you tag anything else using these 4 elements. They have Boolean value types. They can be either true or false depending on which Unicode checkbox is actually being used. There's also a value for a former legal or registered name. If that is being used on your 8K, you would tag that with your company's name. And this is just a normalized string, so you can put any value you want in there. There is also a provision for former address elements. If you have a complete former address that needs to be tagged, you can dimensionalize the address elements by using the entity addresses address type axis as your dimension, and former address member as your member for the dimension to differentiate it from the other elements you're using for your current filing. Now, we just talked a lot about the elements that are being used, and we didn't really talk about the DEI changes. Those effectively are folded into these new requirements. Any of these elements that did not exist in DEI 2018 are now in DEI 2019. So the main difference there is just new elements in DEI 2019 to allow you to comply with these new requirements we just spoke about. They also added a lot of new data types, like we were discussing, country code item type being added, so that you have acceptable values that you can add from an enumerated list of countries that are ISO compliant. So you can add these new values into elements using new item types. But let's take a quick look at a map of what this might actually look like on a cover page. So here we have a sample Form 10Q document with some placements for these tags. Obviously at the top you have your document type. This would be tagged as document type. You have your checkboxes. These would have to be Unicode checkboxes. Right now they're not showing as Unicode checkboxes on the sample. They would have to be filled in as Unicode checkboxes. But these would be the elements quarterly report and transition report. You can see we have our entity registrant name that would appear there. You would actually type the value in and tag it using the actual value entity registrant name. And the file number will be the same way. Below that, the address section would have your address elements. Each needs to be tagged individually using the inline elements that are in the Edgar Filer manual in the appropriate section. You have above that your incorporation state country code, your tax identification number, your city area code, your local phone number, and any registered former names. And these are all required to be in here. The exact way you're going to tag this is going to differ depending on your software vendor. So again, please check with your software vendor well in advance of the filing deadline, so you're aware of how you can use your tools to actually comply with these rules. Our securities portion will look like just generally this simple example for one security where you have only your security 12B title or 12G title, your trading symbol, and your security exchange name. And if you only have the one row, you only have to tag those elements. You don't have to use any dimensional information. If you have two rows for two securities, if they both use the same security exchange name or different exchange names, but they're different securities, then you wouldn't have to dimensionalize it any further than using the statement class of stock axis. If you do have multiple security exchange names under the same class of stock, though, you're going to have to differentiate it by two dimensions using the statement class of stock axis and the security exchange name axis. So this can either be a very simple portion of the filing or slightly more complicated, depending exactly on what you have to tag. Once we move past that, the second page of the 10Q cover has a couple of checkboxes that have to be filled in. And these are going to be using those Boolean values. So you would just highlight the checkbox and tag it with the appropriate value. So if you would, for example, on a yes or no checkbox, like entity reporting status current, you would highlight and tag the yes box if the yes box is checked. If the no box is checked, you would highlight and tag the no box. One of them is going to have to be checked, though. They are required values. So either yes or no needs to be checked off and tagged. Now, each document is going to have different requirements. So a 10Q will have different elements being used as opposed to a 10K, as opposed to an 8K. And these are based on the Edgar Filer Manual 19.2. So that's a great source for these requirements. And it can look like a daunting task to figure out exactly where everything needs to be tagged. So we have created a useful cheat sheet here at NovaWorks Software. You can see we have a link down here to our download. You can download that for free. This link will be included in the slides that Michelle is going to distribute after this meeting. So you can just go to that URL and download a free guide on what elements are to be used where on each filing. And that should help kind of demystify some of these requirements, I hope. But I believe that covers everything I had. Michelle, I'm going to turn it back to you then.
Great, Steve, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. So Steve, if you want to.
There you go.
Great. Okay. Okay, we're going to go to CPE questions in just a minute, but we have a lot of questions and I'd like to try to get through a bunch of these if we can. Okay, the first question I want to address, and this could be either for Lisa or Steve. Let's see, in the 10K or 10Q, we include Exhibit 101 for XBRL today. Is there such an exhibit requirement for 8K for XBRL?
Yeah, I can answer that, Michelle.
Sure.
So you're going to have Exhibit 101 requirements for your schema file, any of your link-based files that are going alongside this. So your 8K is now going to have, going forward after you're required to file an inline XBRL, you're going to have your 8K document along with several Exhibit 101s for the link-based filers.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, the next question let's see. Would cover page tagging be subject to certain documents that don't require XBRL tagging, such as 8Ks containing earnings releases?
Yes, absolutely. This is going to be all 8Ks going forward. After your first inline filing that you do for a 10Q, you're going to need to file all of your 8Ks with this cover page tagging, regardless of the content.
Great, thank you. Okay, so here's another timing question. For Q2 19 filing, if our 10Q is filed after our 8K earnings release, do we need to tag the 8K cover with XBRL? We did early adopt inline XBRL.
So, Michelle, I can answer that one. Based on my interpretation of the rules, and you can always get clarity from your legal counsel. However, based on the rules and what they state, you're not required to file tag cover pages in inline until you've been required to file that first 10Q. It doesn't really mention anything about early adoption, but if you're required to file for the second quarter, then I would believe that you would start tagging the cover pages for the 8K once you've submitted that second quarter 10Q, assuming you're a calendar year filer, to the SEC.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a lot of early adoption questions, and I think that your response kind of covered a lot of that, so we'll skip over those. Okay. Would you need to? Well, let me just address it, like another early adoption question. What about if you voluntarily filed Q1 2019 in inline XBRL? Would you need to tag the cover page of an 8K filed before your Q2 10Q, or only after the Q2 2019 10Q, since the first submission was voluntary?
So I think we just covered that one, Michelle.
Yeah.
And again, they can talk to their legal counsel, but if the rule doesn't specifically talk about voluntary or voluntary filings. The rule simply says that you're required to file for fiscal periods after June 15th, 2019. Once you submit that 10Q, then you're now required to tag the cover pages of your 8K filings.
Right. Okay. Okay, and I think, let's see. Okay, the next question, do we need to migrate to the 2019 taxonomy in order to comply with the FAST Act?
I can answer that. Oh, sorry.
Okay, and I'll say something when you're finished too. So go ahead, Steve.
Sure. Yes, you do need to migrate to the 2019 DEI taxonomy to comply with the FAST Act, because a lot of the elements that are actually specified in the new Edgar Filer Manual 19.2 version are only in the DEI 2019 taxonomy. You're not going to find a lot of these elements in the DEI 2018 taxonomy, so it's not possible to comply without 2019.
But that doesn't mean that you have to file with the 2019 U.S. GAAP taxonomy. I think, again, it depends on your solution, but you can, the DEI taxonomy is separate from the U.S. GAAP taxonomy, so you could file with the 2018 U.S. GAAP taxonomy for Q2 and file with the 2019 DEI taxonomy.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. They're not really tied together. You can definitely use DEI 2019 with US GAAP 2018.
Great. Yeah, I think we had a bunch of questions on that topic, so I'm glad we covered that. The next question, for required visible facts, are those listed as DEI rather than covered? Also required to be visible. Let's see.
Yeah, I actually asked the SEC about that, and the answer I got back was that the differentiation between DEI and cover on the table I displayed was more to just say where the reference to that is located in the Edgar Filer Manual. It doesn't really have to do anything with the visibility of the information. So they're all required to be visible, whether it says DEI or cover in that table. It's more dealing with the location of that fact in the Edgar Filer Manual.
Okay, great. Next question, could you please go over the implementation deadlines for tagging cover pages on 8Ks one more time? Lisa, maybe you could just address that one more time.
Sure. So the first item that has to happen is you have to file a Form 10Q for a fiscal period after June 15th, 2019 for large accelerated filers. So if your first fiscal period after June 15th is June 30th and it's a 10K filing because that's your fiscal year end, you do not have to file that 10K in inline. you would wait until you file your first quarter 10Q for the quarter ended September. And once you do that, then you would start also filing your 8K cover pages in inline XBRL. So the key is your first fiscal period after June 15th. And once that 10Q is filed, then you start filing the 8K cover pages in inline XBRL.
Great, thank you. The next question, if you have multiple debts, do we use one standard tag and then dimensionalize?
You have multiple debts. You're talking about like an 8K. I mean, if you
Debt
definitely,
securities?
if you do have multiple of anything and there's only one element represented, then yes, assigning a dimension and disaggregating the like values is the way to tag it. So no matter what it is, if you have to tag multiple similar values, dimensionalizing it is the appropriate way to do it rather than custom definitions, which I've seen people do as well. So yeah, you would dimensionalize it.
Okay, great. In what situation would multiple source documents be listed in an iXBRL filing shown under the more filters menu option in the XBRL viewer or inline XBRL viewer? Is it when the body of the document as well as an exhibit contain inline XBRL, such as X13s filed with a 10K, exhibit 13s filed with a 10K?
I mean, I imagine that that definitely would only be the case if you have multiple XBRL reports filed as part of the same filing. I'm not familiar with any examples of that myself just yet, but you could technically have multiple sources of XBRL if you do have exhibits that also contain XBRL.
Okay, great. Okay, the next question, will the use of transformations require a filer to include Exhibit 104 in its exhibit list?
The use of transformations shouldn't require anything beyond the standard Exhibit 101s. The transformations are part of the XBRL itself. They're not something separate from it. So it shouldn't require any additional document types being included. I mean, everything effectively uses transformations. If you just tag a regular number, for example, there are transformations to turn a number with a comma in it to just a number without a comma in it. Everything uses them. So it's not like they require additional files in the filing.
Okay, great. Okay, the next question, do all of these new tags go in the DEI? How do you know if a tag needs to go into the DEI? And I'm assuming they mean, are all the new tags in the DEI 2019?
Yeah, all of these tags should be in the DEI. And whether you know if you need to use a tag or not is going to be based on the Edgar Filer Manual 6.5.43 through 53, whichever section is dealing with the relevant DEI elements. I know the Edgar Filer Manual does have some pretty useful tables to show you which elements are required on which form types, so you can see exactly what's required. The cheat sheets I was talking about, with the download link in the slides, also go into detail on what elements are required on which form types. So you can take a look at that after this as well if you want to see which elements are required on a 10Q versus a 20F, for example.
Right, and
Right.
Steve also indicated too that the new tags are in the 2019 DEI taxonomy, which is a newer version from the 2018 DEI taxonomy. So to take advantage of all these new elements, you have to be tagging with the 2019 DEI taxonomy, separate and apart from the US GAAP taxonomy.
Yeah, I just want to mention really quick as well that handout I was talking about that goes over elements. It is marked as preliminary. Just be aware that that was because we wrote it before the EFM was released. Nothing actually changed from the draft to the current EFM. So it is still valid information.
Okay, great. And we will be sending that link out, like embedded in the email itself, not just in the slides, so everybody will get that. Okay, we have a few more questions. What is the difference between exhibits 101 and 104? I don't know, Lisa, you want to jump?
So Exhibit 101 is the traditional exhibits that have been filed for the past 10 years. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of XBRL. So that is the exhibit that is required to be submitted. 104 was a new a new option under Regulation SK, I think, to address the 8K cover page. If that couldn't be included on the cover page, then you have the option to file an Exhibit 104 with that inline information. But you don't have to do both. You'll still always continue to file that Exhibit 101 with your 10Ks, 10Qs, your 8K. But if everything is embedded in that cover page, then you don't have to worry about an Exhibit 104. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that sounds fine.
Okay. Another question, is it possible, is it possible to comply by creating extended DEI tags? So I assume that means by not using the 2019 DEI taxonomy, but extending them.
Yeah, the Edgar Filer manual says you're supposed to use DEI elements, not custom elements. I mean, you could technically create custom elements with the same name and technically file it, but it wouldn't be compliant with the EFM because it wouldn't be under the correct namespace the SEC is expecting.
Okay. Are DEI taxonomy elements visible through Yeti? And I believe that's correct, isn't it? They are?
Yeah, this should be available already.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you just have to select the 2019 DEI taxonomy.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, and here's, we're getting a lot of questions that are kind of around the same topics. So I'm gonna kind of skip some of those. So has there been increased usage of XBRL data by external parties over the years? Who are the primary users? Do you expect this to change anything with inline XBRL? I don't know if you all have any answers to that.
Well, I know I haven't seen any hard statistics, but I do know it is definitely being consumed. A large amount of the traffic from the SEC's website is accessing XBRL data. I don't see inline actually changing anything about how data is consumed because it is virtually identical requirement-wise to regular XBRL. The only difference is how it's viewed by the user and reviewed by the user. So from a data analysis perspective, it's not going to change much. It's going to change mostly the review and actual of the user perception.
Right, and I think what we're seeing in terms of overall usage, just from XBRL US perspective, is that more and more large providers are transitioning to XBRL versus HTML. And in fact, I was on the call today with a large rating agency that has already been adapting to XBRL data and bringing that data in because it's more convenient to process. So there definitely has been, increased usage. I would think on the topic of inline XBRL, as Steve said, it doesn't, the XBRL data can be kind of extracted from the iXBRL document and then consumed that way. But I think it will make it easier for people to quickly read and review the data. And so I think that may increase usage just in terms of, clarifying and, making the data a bit more transparent for usage. Okay, and I'm just going to take one last question here. We're on the 2018 taxonomy. Will the 2019 new tags be available in the 2018? And I think the answer to that one is no, because the new tags are only in the 2019 DEI taxonomy. And so that's the one that is going to be required to be used.
Right, Michelle, and there's been several questions along those lines, and hopefully people aren't confusing the 2018 US GAAP taxonomy to tag their financial statements and footnote disclosures with the DEI taxonomy, because there's multiple taxonomies that the SEC has approved for use, and sometimes it's just not obvious to all of the filers that they're actually pulling elements not just from the US GAAP, from these other taxonomies that the SEC has approved, the DEI being one of them.
Great. And one thing, it was just pointed out that Exhibit 104 describes required content in an inline document. It's not really an Edgar attachment type, EX 104. It's just describing required content. So we have, as I mentioned, gotten a lot of questions. And so I think what we're probably going to do, Lisa and Steve, if you're comfortable with this, is we'll probably take a lot of these questions and put them into a Q&A document and create something over the next week or so that we can put online so that everybody has access to it, because we want to make sure that, you know, everybody has the slide, everybody will get the slides, we'll get the replay, but we'll put together a Q&A so that everybody has quick and ready access to that, because I know there are a lot of questions about timing and about the rule and about the where the elements reside. So is that good with you guys? If you could help me with that?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Absolutely.
Great. Sorry to put you on the spot there. Okay, well, I think I'm going to go to our questions because I want to make sure that everybody's able to respond to the poll questions. And we're going to go to the third poll. I'm going to launch this right now. Okay, so this question is, which list below shows all the forms that require cover page tagging with the SEC FAST Act? Is it forms 10K, 10Q, and 8K? Is it 10K, 20F, 40F, and 10Q? Or is it the third option, 10K, 20F, 40F, 10Q, and 8K? Which of those three lists includes all of the forms that are required to be tagged, where the cover page is required to be tagged? We've got about 20 more seconds here. So again, make sure that you respond to the question if you're going to be getting CPE credit. About 10 more seconds here before we close down the poll. Okay, I'm going to close this down and go to our last question. Okay. So the last poll question, which of the forms noted below does not need to be XBRL tagged per the SEC FAST Act? Is it form 10K? Is it form 6K or form 8K? Which one does not need to be tagged? Okay, so about 30 seconds more on this question. Okay, just about another 10 seconds here. All right, I'm going to shut down the polling now. All right. Thanks everybody for responding to those. And let's see. Bear with me a second while I move my slides. I just want to cover a few final points before shutting down the webinar. We have some other programs coming up. We're going to be holding our annual investor forum, which is being called Driving Actionable Analytics. And that's going to be November in New York City, as it usually is. We don't have a date set because we're waiting to hear back about a potential keynote speaker that we're very excited to be getting. But we'll get that date to you as soon as we can. And then the last program I wanted to mention is just to emphasize our data quality rules. For all of you, remember these are freely available rules and guidance for issuers. They help you automatically identify errors in XBRL filings. And you can generate these error reports based on a filing using Data Quality Committee certified software or by running rules on the XBRL US website. And I just wanted to show you show you where you can find that. Here is our data quality certification page. And this just gives you a list of all of the softwares that are currently certified to work with our rules. And you'll see that we're up to DQC rules and guidance validations, rule set number 8. So look for the tools or applications that have an 8 next to the name, and you'll see the ones that you can work with today that will run the current set of rules. And I also wanted to point out something that has actually been up on our site for some time now, which is what we call filing results and quality checks. And you can find this by going to something called View Errors up here. And this is just really a listing of the latest filings that have come in, and with a number of errors that have been identified for that particular filing. So you can see here, Venture Vanadium Incorporated, they filed their 10Q using the US GAAP taxonomy, and we've identified 11 errors, and that is based on the latest rule set number 8. And you can actually click on that little drop down, and you can see the errors themselves. So here you can see that, let's see, this is the concept stock issued during period share stock splits with a value of -21.8 is dimensionally qualified with the statement equity components axis, but only extension members and the elements defined as children of this axis should be used. So this is what we've identified as an error that the company can go back and correct when they go to their next filing. But this is looking at the latest filings historical listing. So, please take a look at this and look to see the latest set of filing errors. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming to our webinar today. I want to thank Lisa Cousineau from Broadridge Financial Solutions and Steve Horowitz from NovaWorks very much for all of the work they put in on helping define the SEC FAST Act. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out a link to the replay, to the slides from the webinar, to the NovaWorks document that Steve mentioned, and we'll be getting that out to you the next day or so. So thanks again. Oh, and we're also going to be putting together the Q&A on a lot of the questions that we've received about this particular FAST Act. So thanks very much, and we'll see you on our next webinar.